In 1998, a game called MediEvil was released that set out to capture the essence of gothic atmosphere inspired by the likes of Tim Burton's movies. Its hack and slash gameplay combined with its unique protagonist and a dark yet humorous tone presented a wonderfully charming experience that went on to make 2 more titles before being laid to rest. Over 12 years since its last release, Sony has decided to bring the game franchise back with MediEvil Remaster coming to the PS4. This announcement triggered my nostalgia buttons and has made me want to look back at what made MediEvil such a great and memorable series. It all starts with developer Millennium Interactive, who were founded in 1988 by Michael Hayward, Tony Beckwith, and Ian Salter. They went on to create quite a few small titles, with one of their most noticeable being the James Pond platforming series. In January 1996, Chris Sorrell, the director for James Pond 1 and 2, came up with the concept of a game called Dead Man Dan. The idea behind this concept was a game that would combine the gameplay of Capcom's arcade classic Ghouls and Ghosts with the art style present in Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas. With Chris as its creative director and a like-minded lead artist Jason Wilson building on that idea, the game eventually came to be known as MediEvil, dropping a lot of its arcadey features and becoming a third-person action-adventure with puzzle elements in line with Nintendo's Legend of Zelda series. Having only been a 2D studio up to that point though, suddenly creating a 3D game was a big undertaking, especially being an independent developer. The studio, in desperate need for a funding body, began looking for a major publishing deal, pitching to Windows, Sega and Sony. Sony of Europe, impressed by the game's vision and progress, signed on with the studio, and on July 4th, 1997, Millennium Interactive became Sony Computer Entertainment Cambridge. Working in 3D was still problematic for the studio, especially when it came to controlling the character, but fortunately Sony had added dual analog sticks to the PlayStation 1 controller during the game's development, and so MediEvil quickly became one of the first games to support it. As the game's mechanics were being influenced, so too were the score, and much like the visual style, Tim Burton's movies were a huge inspiration for the matching gothic sound. Composer Danny Elfman and his contributions to not only Nightmare Before Christmas, but also Batman and Beetlejuice were the main movies being looked at to influence the score. Ultimately, the game score was composed by Paul Arnold and Andrew Barnabas, commonly known as Bob and Barn, and the duo was able to achieve the same thematic orchestral and organ sounds using electronic synthesizers. The haunting music accompanied by the enchanting choirs immediately invokes a dark and foreboding quality that further immerses you into the world of MediEvil.
Hi, I'm Chris Sorrell. Let me take you through the world of MediEvil.
Upon the game's release in October 1998, MediEvil received generally positive reception with high praise for the unique visuals, music and the atmosphere presented. The camera work in particular was not commended, being criticised for how awkward it was to control and often being stuck on less than ideal positions. Regardless, MediEvil stood out from other games at the time, not only for its setting, but also its main protagonist. Throughout the majority of entertainment, skeletons were depicted as horrific villainous entities that scare or attack the good guys. The most obvious exception to this was The Nightmare Before Christmas, that explored the life of monsters of Halloween, with the main character Jack Skellington searching for something more than the life of scares. Chris and Jason, inspired by the world and creative characters presented by Tim Burton and director Henry Selick, wished to make their own unique lead. They came up with Sir Daniel Fortesque, an undead skeletal knight who had lost his bottom jaw and one eyeball, leaving him only able to mumble his thoughts. Jason not only helped design the character, but actually voiced Sir Daniel by gritting his teeth and speaking with a bucket on his head when recording dialogue. The setup for the character and story was that Sir Dan had been glorified as a hero for him defeating the evil sorcerer Zarok, wishing to take over the kingdom of Gallowmere in 1286, but in actuality, he was killed by a single arrow to the eye long before the battle's conclusion. 100 years later, Zarok has returned to finish the job, and casts a spell over Gallowmere, taking control of its people and bringing the dead back to life. Unintentionally though, this brings back Sir Dan, who now has a chance to redeem himself and become the true hero the history books have depicted him as. Sir Dan's traits match themselves perfectly to a video game, with his missing jaw leaving him unable to do anything but comically mumble, while the various game's inhabitants constantly insult his heroism, driving to want to prove them wrong. His design created the perfect blend of representing the game's themes, while also presenting an iconic character easily recognizable from other games. Interestingly, in the Japanese release of the game, Sir Daniel Fortesque wears a gold helmet in the FMV scenes and in the game, due to the belief that a skeletal head may be seen as a bad spirit rather than a hero in Japan. When it comes to gameplay itself, MediEvil involves you hacking and slashing your way through various creatures of the night as you explore plenty of Halloween-themed locations. From zombie-infested cemeteries to cornfields filled with murderous scarecrows, each new environment is oozing with delightful horrors. Between levels, Sir Dan keeps the same amount of health that increases during the game by attaining life potions, and health can be installed by finding energy vials, rejuvenation fountains, or even by turning enemies into roast chicken. Additionally, there is gold that can be collected throughout each level in order to purchase more ammunition for certain weapons, as well as restore enchantments or durability of items. Although many gameplay elements have similarity with Zelda, the world structure is level by level rather than being open to explore. Multiple paths can be taken though, giving some sense of freedom to the direction you go, and occasionally levels may need to be revisited upon obtaining certain items. 2 dragon gems required in order to get the dragon armor granting immunity to fire were easily missable if you simply move on after defeating the Pumpkin King and don't summon a witch from a cauldron. For the most part, hints are dropped in text entries beside locked or blocked entrances, preventing missing key items from becoming too frustrating to find. Additionally, the overworld map always shows you whether a level is complete, making it easier to determine where you are missing something and requires it to be re-explored. One such indicator that can be found in all main levels is the chalice, that can only be attained by filling it with enough souls of the enemies you defeat in combat. Upon becoming 100% full, the chalice can be collected, and when you complete the level, Sudan is teleported to the Hall of Heroes. Each time you do this, you conduct a comical conversation with a fallen hero, and attain their weapon that progressively become more powerful as you gain more chalices.
Not that there's anything clever about shooting someone in the eye, sir. Oh, goodbye, sir.
Not only did this introduce some additional British humour and storytelling to the game, but also created a very compelling reason to explore and complete each level thoroughly, become a bigger threat to Zarok and his minions. Fortesque ends up being equipped with a complete arsenal of weapons, from initially using his own arm as a boomerang, to crossbows, magical swords, and even the ability to harness lightning. As you become stronger and face off against bosses such as the Stained Glass Demon, you quickly find your investment in finding all the chalices worthwhile. Not all levels are just about killing monsters though, with one of the more interesting levels being the Sleeping Village, in which Sir Daniel is confined to a small area where you cannot kill its possessed civilians if you want to fill the chalice. You go from building to building in search of a specific key to gain access to 2 important items that help you craft a crucifix in order to gain access to a key for a safe that contains the true item you seek. It is a great change of pace and introduces small puzzles that aren't overly complex, yet still satisfying to solve. Other levels like the Pool of the Ancient Dead, in which you jump over small bogs and if timed incorrectly result in an entire health bar being lost, aren't quite as good due to their reliance on platforming. The platforming in general isn't great, and it doesn't help that the camera is pretty terrible for most of the game, often obscuring enemies and obstacles. To complement the various gameplay options is a story that is relatively simple and told more through visual methods than with dialogue. Gargoyles who often insult Sudan's heroism fill in some of the key story points, and there are also optional textbooks throughout the game that dive deeper into the history of Gallowmere.
Forgotten nobodies would be wise to make themselves scarce.
Otherwise, events that play out are what push the narrative forward, such as Sir Daniel accidentally in his pursuit of Zarok releasing the shadow demons from their entombment and setting them loose on Castle Gallowmere. It takes multiple levels before you actually reach this location, and you end up having to bring down the castle to destroy them. This setup of an additional motivation rather than simply stopping Zarok creates a more endearing connection with Dan and has you wishing to fix his mistakes. By the point you finally face Zarok, you have more than grown attached to Sudan and want to see him succeed. Of course, you do defeat his army, champion, and the weird giant reptile thing that he transforms into.
None shall defeat the mighty Zarok.
With redemption finally achieved, Sudan returns to a peaceful slumber, and for players who collect all chalices, receive an alternative ending that finally sees Fortesque inducted into the Hall of Heroes. As usual with game development, not all planned content made it in, with some having to be cut due to technical problems and time constraints.
Bugger.
In early promotional material, a scene was shown where Sir Dan is running from a dragon-like creature called the Jabberwock, that was cut due to difficulty with collision detection and the forest chase just not looking convincing. An FFV sequence of what was intended to be the conclusion to the level, with Sir Daniel being saved by a giant bird at the last minute before the Jabberwock plummets to its death, can still be found in the game and acts as a bridge between levels. There's also an FMV only in the PAL version of the game where a worm comes out of Sir Dan's eye to unlock the door to the asylum that was intended to be a link to the level where you play as a worm called Morton in a side view platform level. This level never fully materialised though, and the asylum almost got cut entirely, but it ended up being repurposed as a fixed angle combat arena as Fortesque works his way down the asylum. With the game's release and success, with over 800,000 units sold, Sony requested that a sequel be developed and released before the end of the original PlayStation's lifecycle. Sorrel, having been MediEvil'd out, wanted to move on to other things and shifted his focus to Primal, a fantasy action adventure game being developed by Sony Computer Entertainment Cambridge for the PlayStation 2. Chris had started penning ideas though and handed them over to the new game's creative director James Shepard, who had previously worked on the first game developed under the Cambridge studio Beast Wars Transformers. Lead artist Jason Wilson stayed on with the franchise and assisted in adapting Chris's ideas, along with most of the original team including the composers Bob and Barn. Some of Chris's ideas stuck, such as a time period of Victorian-era London due to the neo-Gothic revival architectural movement going on during the time. However, rather than implement his proposal of an ancestor of Dan being the playable character, creative director Shepard decided bringing the charming Sir Daniel back to life would be better for the franchise. Shepard's main goal from there was to make sure MediEvil 2 improved on every component of the original, including Fortesque's skill set and equipment, as well as the enemy variety, level design and narrative. Advancing the story 500 years since the first game, events take place in 1886 Kensington, London, with a new antagonist called Lord Palthorn. Palthorn discovers Zarok's evil spellbook and uses it to transform himself and his goons Mander and Dogman into monstrous forms, as well as bring the dead back to life. He is however unable to control them due to missing certain pages, and of course unwillingly brings Sir Daniel Fortesque back, who is housed in a nearby museum. This sets up essentially a two-way chase between Palthorn and Sir Daniel to retrieve Zarok's missing pages. Sir Dan doesn't go alone on his journey this time, with him getting assistance from Professor Hamilton Kift, who has a history with Palthorn, his assistant a squeaky-voiced ghost called Winston, and a mummy princess named Kia who becomes Dan's love interest in the game. For the most part, these allies act as a way to further explore Sir Dan's personality, who isn't quite as incoherent with his mumbling as he was in the first game, and is no longer voiced by artist Jason Wilson.
I'll never join you.
Winston the Ghost serves as a replacement for the first game's gargoyles without the humour angle, and acts as both the tutorial system and save point for longer levels.
Alright Dan, you've come a long way. I'd save if I was you.
Professor Hamilton has his laboratory that acts as a hub between missions to offer dialogue to further explain the story, granting Sir Daniel improved equipment and to instill a sense of progression as you play through the game. MediEvil 2 released in April 2000 and got similar praise as the original game, with the excellent atmosphere being cited as unique from other games coming out at the time. Like MediEvil, the camera was still a big problem, and some reviewers felt the game was overly similar to the previous one. That didn't stop it from winning the year's best console game at the 2000 BAFTA Interactive Entertainment Awards. As opposed to MediEvil, critics liked how the story and locations now felt better connected due to the cutscenes and sharper graphics. However, this better sense of continuity came at the sacrifice of the player's freedom to take on different paths. Though there is a linear path to complete the game's story, the levels themselves are larger, more fleshed out, and include smarter and more varying enemies that include better tactile feedback with limbs falling off zombies. Like the first game, some of these levels switch up the focus and involve puzzle solving rather than simply combat. One of the best levels is Wolfen's Hall, that is basically a haunted mansion filled with vampires, which you have to sneak into and solve various puzzles in order to kill the vampires with sunlight. The music, level and creature design all create a positively creepy quality very reminiscent of the best elements of the first game. It ends with a boss fight with the Count, who cannot be defeated by conventional means but instead requires you to use your environment to reflect his own attacks back. Many other boss encounters also circumvent expectations and have a lot more of a challenge to them than what was found in the original MediEvil. A boxing ring fight where Sir Dan becomes Dunkenstein, a hulking figure of sewn together body parts, is unlike anything in the first game.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Fan Art.
Dunkenstein has to take out Palthorn's Iron Slugger by dodging attacks and getting his own hits in. As he suffers damage, limbs start flying off, and in between rounds has to retrieve them again as a now headless original body. It creates a very memorable moment that is one of the more challenging levels in the game, and grants Daniel an ability that changes up the core gameplay the most.
Curse you! Curse you all!
Suddenly, being able to separate from his body becomes usable in other places and allows the placement of Sir Daniel's head on wandering zombie hands. This scale change often ties into new puzzle mechanics involving having to sneak through areas or control two characters at once to find a solution. It is an interesting idea likely spawned from the Cut Morton Worm level in MediEvil and grants greater diversity in game design, creating larger, more compelling levels that have a lot more to accomplish. Otherwise, combat is mostly the same, just with a more modern twist such as a blunderbuss instead of a magic bow. The Charlatan still reward you with better weapons, but the Hall of Heroes is no longer present. Instead, Professor Hamilton gives you a new weapon for each juice-filled chalice that he uses to power his machines. It isn't nearly as compelling as talking to dead heroes, but is worthwhile nonetheless, with your final chalice reward being a Gatling gun and all its destructive glory. You can also equip more than one weapon at the time now and quickly toggle between them, making it much easier to use both close and long range weapons. All these quality of life improvements in MediEvil 2 just make it a more fun game to play, even if the new world isn't quite as memorable as the first one. The time period is used effectively though, especially via the Whitechapel level that has you solving puzzles and changing costume in order to find Kia who was missing, only to see her murdered by the Ripper. Dan, lost in grief, abandons the mission to stop Palthorn, which is odd considering he's had next to no time to build a meaningful relationship with Kia, who has less than 30 seconds of dialogue in the entire game. Regardless, it sets up an interesting plot that has Fortesque finding a way to save her via a time machine built by Professor Hamilton.
Mercy, honourable knight, spare me.
Fortesque beats the Ripper, and fuses with his former self to gain gold armour, granting an extra life file that can be repaired by the shady shopkeeper. With Daniel fully equipped and his love key saved, you proceed to stop Palthorn, who successfully has obtained the last of Zarok's pages and summoned a giant blue demon. This is no match to the now powered up Sedan, with Palthorn ultimately taking himself out in a kamikaze attempt, and the hero of Gallowmere is victorious once more. Like the first game, there are two different endings. If you haven't collected all chalices, Sir Daniel goes to eternal rest with Kia in her tomb, never to be awoken again. If you get all the chalices though, Sir Daniel and Kia encounter the time machine and decide to ride it through time to the ending of the original MediEvil. However, Zarok's weird lizard form is now Palthorn. It is quite a confusing ending that I always took to mean that Sir Dan travelling through time has had an adverse effect on events connected to his life, and perhaps the next sequel would involve Fortesque being the hero to restore time. The sequel was never meant to be though, and MediEvil disappeared for 5 long years before it took an unexpected return. Website Unseen64 that archives cancelled video games does document a pitched sequel titled MediEvil 3 Fate's Arrow that was being considered for the PlayStation 2, but never got past the design proposal. Loosely using elements of how MediEvil 2 ended, Sir Dan and Kia travel back to before the Battle of Gallowmere that claimed Sir Daniel's life. Things aren't quite going the way they did originally, and it is revealed that Kia had been playing Dan and was actually an Egyptian sorceress wishing to align herself with Zarok to fulfill her evil ambitions. Kia's plan was to prevent the death of Sir Daniel, causing him to doom the Gallowmere militia with his cowardly leadership and stop them from defeating Zarok. The game would have explored who the living Daniel Fortesque was in stark contrast to the undead hero he had become, with the story ultimately leading to him making a final sacrifice to ensure the timeline remained as it should. The gameplay was going to be more open with a hub-based world and adding in a new companion sidekick who could assist in combat called Lubo, who was Fortesque's faithful hand from when he was alive. The Hall of Heroes would have returned and Sir Dan was going to get a new ability that enabled him to ride beasts into battle. Sadly, it just wasn't meant to be. However, certain elements such as an item called an Anubis Stone to summon an army of the dead and a genie ally called Al-Zalam were incorporated into what became MediEvil Resurrection.
I, Al-Zalam, glorious genie of the Sultan Prince Razim the Ribald.
On May 11, 2004, Sony unveiled their first handheld console called the PSP, to release first in Japan at the end of the same year. Sony Cambridge was approached with a mandate from Sony's senior management that they would develop a launch game for the console's EU release on September 1st, 2005. Due to this requirement, only a bit more than 1 year of development time was available, and so the studio decided it would remake the first MediEvil. With both main creative leads Sorrell and Wilson having moved on to other projects along with their core MediEvil developers, a new design team was formed with Pierre Jackson as the producer to help direct the game. Despite many of the original game's developers still working at Cambridge Studios, only 3 of the original team were added to the game, due to the studio directing that what's left of the original team, including Sorrell, were to work on the 24 TV shows game. MediEvil 1 and 2's character animator Mitch Phillips came on as lead artist, with composer Bob and Barn returning once again to compose the soundtrack. Sorrell and Wilson were credited as consultants for the game, although with only a small amount of actual involvement, but Sir Dan did become an incoherent mumbler again, and Wilson reprised his role. Piers Jackson's goal was for the game to be a reimagining rather than simply a remake of the first game, with better graphics, improved gameplay, and a more fleshed out story, as well as a newly constructed orchestral soundtrack inspired by the original's music.
Oh no, tain't her doing. It's that Pumpkin King as rules them now.
For the most part, the game followed the same structure that the original did. However, there is now a genie trapped inside Dan's skull called El Salam that acts as a tutorial system and a way for Dan to interact with someone throughout the game.
You just a big coward! Buried as big hero with poor genie still trapped inside his head.
Titled Medievil Resurrection, the game successfully hit the EU PSP launch date and went on to sell over 1 million copies worldwide, despite having mixed opinions from the critics. Even on a new system, the camera controls were considered poorly implemented when in the heat of battle, with weapon collision detection feeling clumsy and inaccurate. The expanded story and dialogue led to the biggest innovation on the original, being the vocal work and cutscenes that were the most positively praised piece of the game, in particular work by ex-Doctor Who actor Tom Baker as both the narrator and Grim Reaper.
Pumpkin Gorge, not George, Gorge. Pumpkin George hasn't been around these parts for years.
Many of these lines are hilarious and definitely changes up the overall attitude presented in the game.
I may have to take on an intern.
For the most part, this influx of British humour added more personality to the majority of characters, such as the witches and ex-heroes you encounter.
Modern warfare is a question of science, and the foremost scientific instrument in the world is the shield, and I pan them with it in the face.
The trade-off for this humour is the game loses the more unnerving, burden-esque edge that the original was able to achieve, and so Dan's Quest comes off more of a silly Halloween-themed cartoon with a laughable antagonist than a ghoulish fantasy adventure. This lack of scary and serious moments goes against the original design, and series creator Chris Sorrell was disappointed with the changes made and wished he'd been allowed to direct it, although he did commend them on Sir Dan's physical redesign and working under a tight time constraint. Jason Wilson mostly agreed with Chris's sentiment, noting how some key levels had been omitted, such as the Asylum Gardens and the riddles of Jack of the Green.
Did you spot my bluff? I pretended that riddle was hard, but in truth it was obviously an elephant.
MediEvil Resurrection did feature many modern quality of life improvements though, such as not losing a full health file after falling in water, different weapons having their own combos, improved platforming, and being able to use your wealth to buy health files.
Hello, stranger. What can I sell you today? A nice bit of schmatter?
As multiplayer was also a focus due to the game being on a portable system, developers included a collection of mini-games to add some extra challenge and a reason to return to the game in small increments. For mastering all mini-games, you're rewarded with the strongest weapon in MediEvil, being a huge sword that kills most enemies in one hit. It basically removes any challenge in the game, but is definitely an epic sword to wield. Additionally, an entire new level called Scurvy Docks was added that was a great addition by not only offering greater context for the larger ghost ship battle later, but also adapting a costume change level similar to that of Whitechapel Mission from MediEvil 2. Other improvements, such as being able to dual-wield weapons, was not incorporated across, and the levels remained short like they were originally. Otherwise, the game's locations and story hit relatively the same beats that the original did, but just with more emphasis and explanations.
One must unleash the lava behind the castle floodgates. Burn the blighters where they stand, or even where they sit. Probably hurt more. I knew you'd volunteer.
The final Zarok confrontation is more built up due to a new subplot that involves collecting Anubis stone pieces throughout the game in order to raise an undead army capable of defeating Zarok's forces, as opposed to just the Chalice in the original game.
Gallowmere! And its suburbs.
Zarok's transformation is a disappointingly standard affair, with him turning into a giant snake that will have you missing whatever it was he turned into in the first game. As a whole, the game was a fun but flawed remake that took the series in a more comical direction that at the very least was technically superior and wasn't an exact copy of what had come before. Unfortunately, that was where the road ended, at least as far as main titles go, but Sir Daniel has made some other appearances. Before he awoke in Victorian-era London, Sir Dan got to practice his swing in the US release of Hot Shot Golf 2. Essentially just an alternative character skin, Sir Dan wears his default gear and has his own unique animations for the game. So Daniel Fortesque's most recent and substantial appearance though was the addition to the PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale game. Being pulled together with a variety of PlayStation icons, Zidane features a moveset that combined many of his signature weapons and abilities from the MediEvil games. Key items from the Hero's Chalice to the Anubis Stone were included as part of his super moves, and the gold or dragon armor can be worn as alternative costumes. Additionally, a DLC stage was added that featured Medievil Resurrection Cemetery Hill level as the background, including the game's gargoyle that proceeded to insult various player characters as the match goes on. This was the last official content featuring Sir Daniel, however many fans have been going out of their way to show Sony what a modern MediEvil could look like. Thankfully, Sony was listening, and at PSX in December 2017 decided it was time for Zidane to return once more. No specifics were given other than it will be fully remastered in 4K and more details will drop soon. From the very short announcement trailer, we can surmise from the voice work, silhouettes and scenes shown that this will be a remake of Resurrection, not the original game. Sadly, we also know the original development studio that became Guerrilla Cambridge will not be taking up the reins again as they got shut down just over a year ago. Additionally, the PlayStation News website Push Square interviewed the game's key creators Chris Sorrell and Jason Wilson about the remake and found out they were as shocked as the fans were to find out the series was getting a remaster. Sorrell and Wilson both voiced their concern about not being consulted and what the source for this remaster would be, hoping that it would be in line with the definitive original as opposed to the comical Resurrection. Hopefully, whoever does this remake can encapsulate more of the darker and serious tone featured in the original, while giving them the same level of detail improvements that can be found in Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy. Of course, the series composers Bob and Barn need to return for another fantastic reimagining of the classic tracks. I personally would also love to see the inclusion of MediEvil 2, considering it currently isn't available by any official means except owning the physical PS1 copy. If Resurrection is the direction to go, then it would be great to see the inclusion of lost content like the Jabberwock Chase level, or just levels they didn't include from the original like the Time Device and Ant Caves. Regardless, I'm glad that a classic franchise is coming back that didn't quite get the same level of appreciation that some others did. Let's hope that Zidane can return in a glorious fashion, and perhaps pave the way to the sequel that never happened. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, and thank you so much for watching. For more gaming and geeky content, stay tuned to Optional Extra.